April the 21st, 1945. A clearing in the woods between Duburg and Linthof, Germany. Field Marshal Walter Maude stood by himself among the trees, his service pistol feeling heavy in his hand. Behind him were the shattered remains of Army Group B, over 300,000 soldiers who had given up to American troops in the days before. He faced an impossible decision that wasn't really a decision. Before we continue, show your support by subscribing and letting me know where you're watching from. He could not give up and break his promise. He would not see his country captured by the Soviets. The gunshot that echoed through the woods that afternoon meant more than just one man's end. It represented the final outcome of an event that would puzzle war experts for many years. Between March and May 1945, almost 3 million German soldiers gave themselves up to American and Western Allied troops. They often walked for miles through their own lines of defense to get to American locations, dropping their guns without a single shot, and coming out of strongholds with white flags made from bed sheets and tablecloths. They didn't give up because their defenses had broken, or because they were out of bullets, or even because the war was over. They gave up for one specific reason, on purpose, and with great urgency, to escape one outcome more than any other: being taken by the Soviet Red Army. The numbers show a story of a mass surrender like never before. From June 6, 1944, when Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, to April 30, 1945, the day Hitler took his life in his Berlin bunker, more than 2.8 million German soldiers gave themselves up to Western Allied troops on the northwestern European front. Out of these amazing numbers, 1.5 million gave up in April 1945 alone. During the first 2 weeks of that month, 39,000 Germans were giving up every day. In the last 16 days, that number rose to a high of 59,000 per day. These men surrendered while Hitler was still alive, while the Nazi government was still running, and while military law still ordered them to fight until they died. They had weapons, ammunition, and strong defensive spots. What they didn't have was the desire to turn eastward, where the Red Army was pushing forward like an unstoppable machine of revenge and punishment. To grasp why almost 3 million German soldiers would pick giving up instead of fighting on, you have to understand what they knew about two very different outcomes. Every German soldier on the Western Front in 1945 had heard the stories from the East. The stories spread in quiet talks, in letters that got past military mail checkers, and in the empty looks of men moved to the West from the Eastern Front. These weren't propaganda stories made to encourage them to fight. These were stories from men who had seen with their own eyes what happened when German troops were captured by the Soviets. They knew about Stalingrad, where 91,000 survivors of the 6th Army gave up in February 1943. They knew that out of those 91,000 men, only about 6,000 would ever see their homes again. The others died in the months after they were captured, from starvation, sickness, the cold, and being forced to work in Soviet prison camps. They knew about the death marches where Soviet troops forced captured Germans to walk hundreds of miles into Russia without enough food, water, or rest, shooting anyone who couldn't keep up. They knew about the mining camps in Siberia, the work groups in the Urals, and the harsh conditions that killed over 1 million German prisoners before 1956. They knew these things not as far-off chances, but as near certainties. The West German Maschke Commission, set up after the war to look into the fate of prisoners of war, recorded that 194,250 German prisoners died in Soviet hands out of 3,000 to 60,000 captured. For a German soldier thinking about surrendering, this meant a more than 1 in 3 chance of dying, even after the fighting was over. But the fear that pushed Germans to the West was about more than just survival numbers. It came from a deep understanding of what German soldiers had done in the Soviet Union. From June 22, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa started the biggest military attack in human history, German soldiers had fought what they called a war of annihilation. The Nazi way of thinking had labeled Slavic people as Untermenschen, or subhuman, seeing them as only good for being made slaves or being killed off. German leaders had made plans to starve 30 million Soviet civilians on purpose to create Lebensraum, or living space, for German settlers. The German army had intentionally starved 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war to death out of 5.7 million that were caught, a death rate of 57%. To compare, only 3% of British and American prisoners died while held by Germans. German forces had been directly involved in the Holocaust on Soviet land, where 2 million of the 6 million murdered Jews were killed. They had burned down villages, killed fighters, and people they suspected were fighters along with their families, and used group punishment policies that killed whole towns. The blood of 26 million Soviet soldiers and civilians was on German hands. Every German soldier in 1945 was aware of this, whether he had personally fired a gun or lit a match. They knew that when Soviet troops came for them, they were not just coming as soldiers, but as agents of justified revenge for countless terrible acts. The difference with the American troops couldn't have been greater. From the very first encounters, German soldiers met an American style of fighting that went against everything Nazi propaganda had told them about their enemies. From the first meetings with American troops, the way German soldiers were treated surprised them. American forces, following direct commands from Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower, strictly followed international laws about prisoners of war. Medical help was given. Enough food was handed out. The injured were cared for. Prisoners were not killed, tortured, or forced to work in ways that broke the Geneva Convention rules. The news about how Americans treated prisoners spread through German lines faster than any official message could have. Soldiers who had given up earlier were sometimes kept in temporary holding areas that could be seen from German defense positions. Their fellow soldiers could see them alive, mostly unhurt, and getting food and medical help. This visual proof of survival was stronger than any propaganda. When the 317,000 men of the Ruhr Pocket started to give up in large numbers between April 14th and 18th, 1945, many had clearly thought it through. They were surrounded, had few supplies, and had to choose between trying to escape eastward toward German lines and Soviet forces or westward toward American positions. Field Marshal Model had broken up Army Group B instead of officially surrendering, which gave his men unstated permission to decide their own future. The vast majority of them walked west. The strategic thinking wasn't just about saving their own skins, but also about a kind of national survival. By May 1945, thoughtful Germans knew that their country's survival relied on the Western Allies, especially America, being willing to let Germany rebuild instead of facing Soviet-style control and use. The stream of surrenders in the spring of 1945 had started to form months before, as the military situation made a German loss certain. After D-Day on June 6, 1944, when American, British, and Canadian troops set up their landing spot in Normandy, the Western Front became a noose that was slowly getting tighter. By September, Allied forces had freed France. By December, they were at Germany's western edge, even with the short-term delay of the Battle of the Bulge. At the same time, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet powerhouse that had been growing since the win at Stalingrad moved steadily west. Operation Bagration, which began on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Barbarossa, wiped out German Army Group Center and cost Germany between 400,000 and 450,000 casualties in 9 weeks, the biggest German loss in military history. By January 1945, Soviet troops were on German land in East Prussia and had moved to within 100 miles of Berlin. The German military was caught in a strategic trap, squeezed between two huge Allied armies. Its soldiers were worn out, its factories were damaged by strategic bombing, and its fuel was almost gone. But the key point, the thing that made German soldiers make their desperate choice, was that these two Allied armies stood for two totally different futures for captured Germans. The choices made by German leaders in early 1945 showed how much they understood this situation and tried to use it to their advantage. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who took over Germany after Hitler's death on April 30th, followed a plan that historians later called a strategy of successive partial capitulations in the West. His aim, made clear in captured German papers now at the National Archives, was to buy time to move as many Eastern military units westward as he could and have them surrender whole to the British and Americans, saving them from being captured by the Soviets or Yugoslavs. Starting with the surrender in Italy on April 29, 1945, Dönitz tried to arrange separate surrenders to Western Allied troops while still battling the Soviets. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery took the surrender of German troops in the Netherlands, Northwest Germany, and Denmark on May 4th. On May 6th, General Alfred Jodl came to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims and offered to surrender all troops fighting the Western Allies while still fighting against Soviet forces. General Eisenhower's answer destroyed this plan. He threatened to block all Western routes to German soldiers, making them surrender to the Soviets unless Germany agreed to an unconditional surrender on all fronts at the same time. Facing this final demand, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, at Reims, which ended the war in Europe. The Soviets, who were worried they had been left out of a separate peace deal, demanded a second signing event in Berlin on May 8th with their involvement, which they saw as the official legal surrender. The Battle of Hallberg gives maybe the most powerful example of how desperate the Germans were to not be captured by the Soviets. From April 24th to May 1st, 1945, what was left of the German Ninth Army, about 200,000 soldiers, plus tens of thousands of civilian refugees, were surrounded by Soviet forces in a small area southeast of Berlin. Their leader, General Theodor Busse, ordered a breakout attempt to the west toward American positions near the Elbe River, knowing that giving up to the Soviets would likely mean death. What happened next was a massacre. Soviet artillery, tanks, and soldiers hit the surrounded area without mercy. German troops fought with desperate energy, not to win military goals, but just to get through the Soviet circle and reach the Americans. About 30,000 German soldiers managed to break through to American lines. This was about one-third of those who were surrounded, showing some German success in the breakout. The total number of deaths, including both soldiers and civilians, was probably between 24,000 and 60,000. To compare, in the Battle of the Ruhr Pocket, where Germans gave up to Americans, about 10,000 died, while 317,000 were taken as prisoners. The difference says a lot about which future German soldiers chose. The German government's own post-war group, led by Erich Maschke, looked into the fate of German prisoners of war and discovered that about 3 million were taken by the Soviet Union, and of those, 1,094,250 died in captivity between 1941 and 1955. The group found that 549,360 died between 1941 and April 1945, and 542,911 died between May 1945 and June 1950, after the war was over. These numbers, taken from German and Soviet records, show a pattern of death. The death rate in Soviet camps was over 35%. For Germans held by the Americans, less than 1% died. The men giving up in the spring of 1945 didn't have these exact numbers, but they knew the basic truth behind them. Soviet captivity meant a high chance of death. American captivity meant a high chance of survival. The way German prisoners of war were treated by Americans at first happened under tough conditions. The Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine Meadow camps, where hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were first kept in open fields, were set up quickly in April 1945 to deal with the sudden rush of surrenders. The logistical problem of handling 1.5 million prisoners in 1 month while still fighting a war stretched resources thin. Conditions were hard, especially in the first few weeks, with not enough shelter and food shortages as supply lines had trouble keeping up with the numbers. However, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force tried to make things better, and by the summer of 1945, prisoners were being moved to permanent camps with proper facilities. The real death count in these camps, based on the 1974 Maschke Commission report, was about 4,000 to 6,000 prisoners, which is roughly a 1% death rate. Claims by author James Back of 800,000 to 1 million deaths have been completely proven wrong by historical experts, who showed that his other losses column was really about administrative moves and releases, not deaths. The speed at which organized German resistance fell apart in the West, compared to the fierce fighting that went on in the East until the very last day, shows how strong this preference was. Think about where German casualties happened. German military deaths added up to about 5.3 million, according to historian Rudiger Overmann's detailed statistical work. Of these, about 4 million deaths were on the Eastern Front, which is 75% to 80% of all German war deaths, compared to about 1 million on Western and other fronts. The intensity of the fighting, the no-mercy style of the battle, and the resolve of both sides to fight to the end led to death rates much higher than those in the West. In the Battle of Berlin alone, from April 16th to May 2, 1945, German forces lost about 92,000 to 100,000 killed, 220,000 wounded, and 480,000 captured. The city was defended house by house, street by street, with Hitler Youth and old men fighting with regular army soldiers. Ammunition ran out, food ran out, and medical supplies ran out. Still, the defenders kept fighting, even as Soviet artillery turned the city into rubble. On the Western Front, in contrast, German units with ammunition, with defensive positions, and with the ability to fight back, chose not to. The surrender of the Ruhr Pocket showed this situation perfectly. From April 1st, when American forces finished surrounding them, to April 18th, when the last resistance stopped, German defenders had every geographical benefit. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial center, a crowded urban area with factories, buildings, and infrastructure that helped defenders. Army Group B had 370,000 men, 19 divisions, plenty of ammunition, and defensive positions. If they had decided to fight a Stalingrad-style city defense, American forces would have paid a heavy price to take the area. Instead, large-scale surrenders started on April 14th, after Model broke up Army Group B. Whole divisions walked into American hands without firing a gun. The 116th Panzer Division, an experienced unit that had fought from Normandy through the Ardennes, gave up with no working tanks or artillery left. But the men themselves were fine and able to fight as infantry. They chose being captured over fighting. Total American casualties in taking the Ruhr Pocket were about 10,000. German surrenders were 317,000. The math of that exchange, less than 1 American casualty for every 30 Germans captured, shows that most Germans gave up without a struggle. This pattern happened again across Western Germany in April 1945. American forces moving through central Germany found what Eisenhower called a whipped army. Towns and cities gave up with white flags and little or no resistance. German units would retreat only to give up at the next meeting. The daily number of captures tells the story with harsh clarity. In March 1945, American and British forces were taking about 10,000 German prisoners a day. In the first 2 weeks of April, that number jumped to 39,000 a day. In the final 16 days of April, it reached a high of 59,000 a day. These weren't all captures of surrounded or beaten units in battle. Many were voluntary surrenders from units that had walked away from their defensive spots to give themselves up. The strategic choice these soldiers made was clear. They could see the end was near, and had made up their minds. If they stayed and fought the Americans, they would only delay the end by a few days, and then Soviet forces would sweep over Germany from the east while they were bleeding out in the west. If they retreated east, they would eventually be caught by the Soviets. The Americans were their only hope to survive the war and rebuild their lives. By May 1945, thoughtful Germans knew their country's survival depended on the Western Allies' willingness to let Germany rebuild. German soldiers who gave up to Americans were, in a way, choosing which post-war Germany they wanted to live in. The question of why German forces in the East kept fighting so hard, even as the West fell apart, requires knowing the different kind of defeat in the two areas. In the West, German forces could surrender and expect to live. Individual commanders could figure that giving their men up to American captivity saved those lives for Germany's future. In the East, surrendering gave no such guarantee. The death rate in Soviet camps meant that giving up a unit to the Red Army was like sentencing 1 in 3 men to death. Commanders who had led their men through years of harsh war could not bring themselves to give them that fate without trying every other option. Also, in the East, every day of continued fighting in theory allowed more German civilians to escape westward, away from the Soviet advance. The refugee crisis that hit eastern Germany in early 1945 saw millions of German civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, running from the approaching Red Army. These refugees had heard the stories too. They fled west any way they could, on foot, in horse-drawn carts, in packed trains, carrying whatever they could. German military forces in the East saw their job in the war's final weeks as being a shield for this civilian escape. This complex mix of military common sense, national loyalty, personal fear, and an awareness of shared guilt influenced German surrender choices in 1945. The men making these choices were not mainly driven by a moral understanding of their crimes, though some did show such awareness. They were soldiers making choices about survival in extremely hard situations. Their choice to surrender to Americans instead of Soviets was a logical calculation of which option gave them the best chance of living through the war's end. That calculation was influenced by what they knew of their own crimes on the Eastern Front and the certain Soviet reaction, by what they saw of American treatment of prisoners, and by their view of post-war realities. The last days of the war in Europe saw this situation play out with powerful intensity. After the unconditional surrender was signed on May 7th and 8th, 1945, German forces in some places kept fighting for a short time, trying to reach Western lines before the surrender took effect. The Courland Pocket in Latvia, where Army Group North had been cut off since October 1944, gave up to Soviet forces on May 9th after the grace period ended. German forces in Czechoslovakia fought Soviet troops while trying to break through to American positions. The Prague Uprising, which started on May 5th when Czech resistance groups attacked German forces, grew into brutal street fighting. German units fought back with extreme violence even after the war was officially over because they were afraid that Czech fighters would hand them over to Soviet forces. Only when American and Soviet forces met and set up clear dividing lines did the fighting finally stop. The experience of being captured for those Germans who did surrender to American forces would shape their post-war memories and their relationship with the United States for many years. The Rhine Meadow Camp period, as hard as it was followed by relatively humane treatment as prisoners were moved to permanent camps and eventually sent home. Most German prisoners held by Western Allies returned home between 1945 and 1948. They came back to a destroyed Germany, to cities turned to rubble by strategic bombing, to a collapsed economy, to a nation split into occupation zones. But they came back alive. They got married, raised families, rebuilt their towns, and became citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany in the West or the German Democratic Republic in the East, depending on where they ended up. Many became strong supporters of Western democracy and the Atlantic Alliance. The Soviet prisoners held by the Soviet Union had a very different future. The roughly 480,000 captured during the Battle of Berlin and the million-plus taken in the final months on the Eastern Front entered a system made to get the most work out of them before they were let go. The Soviet Union had suffered incredible destruction during the war. 26 million dead, 1,700 cities and towns destroyed, 32,000 factories ruined. The German invasion had caused an economic disaster that would take decades to fix. Soviet leaders, while officially following Geneva Convention rules, put rebuilding before prisoner well-being. German prisoners of war became a forced labor group, working in mines, factories, on construction projects, and in farming. Conditions got better after the crisis years of 1945 to 1946, when famine threatened the Soviet Union and prisoners barely lived on starvation-level food. By 1947, death rates had dropped a lot as the Soviet economy stabilized, but being sent home was slow. Most German prisoners were let go between 1947 and 1950, but the last ones didn't come home until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. The impact of these surrender choices went far beyond individual survival. The nearly 3 million German soldiers who gave up to Western forces became the base of West German society in the post-war time. They came home with experience of American military strength, American organizational skill, and American willingness to treat enemies by set rules. These experiences, along with the Marshall Plan aid that rebuilt West Germany and the American security promise that protected it from Soviet expansion, created the basis for the Federal Republic's turn toward the West and its joining of NATO. The generation of German leaders who built post-war democracy had, in many cases, personally chosen American captivity over Soviet revenge. The question of whether these German soldiers who gave up in large numbers in 1945 were held responsible for their part in Nazi crimes is still complex and not fully answered. The great majority were never put on trial. War crimes trials focused on top leaders, SS members, concentration camp staff, and those directly involved in specific terrible acts. The average German army soldier, even if he had served on the Eastern Front, even if he had seen or taken part in crimes, generally went home after being a prisoner without facing legal consequences. This led to a situation where millions of men who had taken part in a war of aggression and genocide went back to civilian life and became part of post-war society. The Soviet Union's different way of handling captured Germans showed different priorities and different historical experiences. Soviet authorities tried to use German prisoner labor to rebuild what the German invasion had destroyed. They held prisoners longer, worked them harder, and released them more slowly than the Western Allies. The division of Germany into occupation zones, which became the division between East and West Germany, meant that German soldiers' choices about surrendering in 1945 often decided which Germany they would live in later. Those who gave up in the West usually went back to West Germany. Those captured in the East usually settled in East Germany after being released. Looking back over the decades, the mass German surrender of 1945 is one of the most striking military collapses in history. It's notable not for how fast it happened, but for how selective it was. German forces didn't just give up when they knew they would lose. They gave up to certain enemies while still fighting others. They made logical choices about survival and acted on those choices as a group. The nearly 3 million who gave up to Western allies were voting with their feet and their guns against continued Nazi resistance and against Soviet captivity. They chose survival over honor, the future over the past, American practicality over Soviet revenge. The final count of World War II in Europe, therefore, includes this amazing statistic. German military resistance fell apart in the West, where soldiers could give up and expect to live, while fighting went on in the East, where where giving up meant a possible death. The casualties show this imbalance. The number of German killed and wounded was much higher than prisoners taken on the Eastern Front. The number of German prisoners was much higher than killed and wounded on the Western Front. The human price of this difference was huge. Every German soldier who died fighting the Red Army in 1945 was a man who might have lived if his location had put him against Americans instead. Every Soviet soldier who died in 1945 fighting Germans fell while defeating an enemy that was at the same time surrendering in huge numbers in the West. For the Americans who took in this stream of surrenders, the experience was both satisfying and troubling. American forces took pride in following military law and treating prisoners properly. The mass surrenders showed that German soldiers recognized American discipline and fairness. Yet American commanders also knew why Germans were giving up. They knew about the Eastern Front. They knew what German forces had done in the Soviet Union. They were aware that Germans were running from justice more than they were looking for mercy. General Eisenhower, in his messages with his Soviet counterparts, had to handle the tricky balance between keeping alliance promises and managing the human flood at his force's front door. The post-war years showed the long-lasting effect of these surrender choices. West Germany, largely populated by men who had given up to Western allies, became a successful democracy and a main American ally. East Germany, where many former prisoners from Soviet camps settled after release, became a communist dictatorship under Soviet rule. When the two Germanys came together again in 1990, the psychological effects of these wartime choices still influenced German society. The Atlantic focus of a unified Germany, its dedication to NATO and European unity, its partnership with the United States, all were partly built on the foundation laid when millions of German soldiers decided that Americans were enemies they could surrender to and live. The story of why German forces gave up in such huge numbers to Western allies instead of facing the Soviets is, in the end, a story of logical choice in extreme situations. The difference between the futures waiting for prisoners in the East versus the West was clear and could not be denied. Those who gave up to Americans faced about a 1% chance of dying in captivity. Those who fell into Soviet hands faced a better than 1 in 3 chance of never coming home. Given that choice, millions walked west. The 480,000 German soldiers captured by Soviet forces during the Battle of Berlin had no such choice. Surrounded in the capital with no American army to surrender to, they fought until the very end and then faced the fate their countrymen had spent months desperately trying to escape. The soldiers who gave up rather than fight faced no Americans in a final battle. Instead, they faced a future where Americans would be allies instead of enemies, where survival was possible, where Germany could rebuild. They gave up their weapons, but they saved their lives. In the harsh math of the war's end, they made the choice that 3 million men facing death would make. They walked toward those most likely to let them live. That this choice was open to them in the West, but not the East, explains the dramatic imbalance of German resistance in 1945. It explains why the Western Front fell apart while the Eastern Front fought on. It explains why American forces took nearly 3 million prisoners while taking relatively few casualties, while Soviet forces had to fight for every mile, every city, every building at a huge cost in blood. The math of Allied victory in Europe was written not just in battlefield strategies and strategic bombing, but in the basic difference between two kinds of captivity. One offered survival, the other offered likely death. German soldiers, whatever their crimes, whatever their beliefs, whatever their loyalty to the Nazi regime, understood this difference. When they had the chance, they chose to live. That choice, made by millions of individuals in the spring of 1945, ended major German resistance in the West, sped up the end of the war, and shaped the post-war world in ways that are still felt today.